Hey, I'm Sam, and welcome to the 7th grade Wax Museum. Today, I've invited some famous figures from history to come join me. First, we have George Washington. So what are you most famous for, George?
I am famous for many reasons. Most people immediately think of how I was the first president, but I would say I'm most famous because I was a leader. I guided our country through its early days and made it what it is today.
Interesting. How did you get your start?
Well, I had a half-brother named Lawrence, who most people actually don't know, but he was one of my best friends growing up. Unfortunately, one day in 1752, he passed away. Though it was devastating, it led me on to taking a spot in the militia, and over time, I became a more important role in the militia by becoming the Continental Army's leader.
What is something most people don't know about you?
I would say something most people don't know is that I really grew up with nobody. Of course, in my young childhood, I had my mom and my dad, but my dad died when I was 11, and I was never close with my mom. She was always a cold, bossy woman, and I never really liked her. All I had growing up was Lawrence, really, but it's never the same without having a close relationship with your mom and your dad in your childhood.
Okay. And who or what influenced you the most in your life or work?
I would say Lawrence truly influenced me the most in my life. After all, he was the reason I joined the militia in the first place, which is the reason for some of my greatest accomplishments. But I really just wanted to make him proud. He was one of the few people I could look up to as a young boy.
Okay. Thank you, George Washington. And next, we have Rosa Parks. Welcome to the show. What are you most famous for?
I am most famous for the bus boycott. I was tired one day and wanted to sit at the front of the bus. You see, colored people have to sit in the back of the bus, and white people get to sit in the front of the bus. If all the white people fill up the whole bus, then colored people have to stand up. A white man came onto the bus and asked me to get up. I refused because why can't he just sit beside me? Why do I have to get up and get to the back of the bus just because of the color of my skin? I got arrested, but I made my point.
What is something that most people don't know about you?
Most people don't know that I love sewing, and I accepted a job as a seamstress in a shirt factory, and sewing became my daily life. I also loved fishing with my grandpa.
Cool. Did you always know what you were going to do, or did something happen to put you on the path to success?
I never knew that I'd be named the most influential and powerful figure of the century. I just knew that segregation was unfair and what they were doing was wrong. So I did something about it.
And finally, what piece of advice would you give to someone that wants to follow in your footsteps?
To everyone out there, I just want to say, never give up and do not set low goals for yourself.
Okay, thank you, Rosa Parks. And now we have Paul Revere. So, Paul, what are you most famous for?
I'm most famous for being a master silversmith and a member of the Sons of Liberty. Many people know who I am because of my famous midnight ride and my drawing of the Boston Massacre.
Okay, what is something most people don't know about you?
Many people don't know that I had 16 children and 50 grandchildren. Many people don't know that I was caught in Lexington and never made it to Concord on my midnight ride.
Who or what influenced you the most in your life?
My father influenced me the most by teaching me how to become a master silversmith and teaching me how to work at the silver shop. He died when I was 19, so I had to take over the silver shop and I became a colonial soldier.
And lastly, do you have any interesting hobbies?
When I was not working in the silver shop, I would make surgical instruments and worked as an amateur dentist. In the silver shop, I made things like copper sheeting for the bottom of U.S. naval ships.
Cool. Thank you for joining us today, Paul Revere. Next, we would like to welcome Annie Oakley to the show. So, what are you most famous for?
I'm famous for sharpshooting. Most people know me as a legendary frontwoman at the Buffalo Bills Wild West Show.
How did you get your start?
When I was 5 years old, I lost my father. Our family began to go poor, and my mother only got paid $1.25 a week, and it wasn't enough to keep our family going. So I grabbed the gun above the chimney, and I went out and killed a squirrel to keep my family from starving. And then it's like when I pulled the trigger, like a drilling just went off in my blood. I loved it. So I just started entering contests, and it just went from there.
Interesting. Did you always know what you were going to do, or did something happen to put you on your path to success?
No, I didn't. My mother thought that I shouldn't use guns, that it was dangerous, that women shouldn't have to use guns, but you'll do about anything to keep your family from starving. And I just had enough of it, and sharpshooting was a way that I could make money, and I loved it, and it was a way I could feed my family. So until I went big, and then everybody just knew me.
And finally, what piece of advice would you give to someone that wants to follow in your footsteps?
Don't be scared. If you want it, go after it. Aim at a high mark and you'll hit it.
Thank you, Annie Oakley.
Thank you.
Next, we have Princess Diana. So what are you most famous for?
I would say always being a loving and kind person, and also the Princess of Wales. I started out as an assistant kindergarten teacher, but I soon met Prince Charles and he changed my life.
What is something that most people don't know about you?
I would say that I sold lots of my dresses and earned about $3.25 billion, and it all went to help cancer and AIDS patients.
Interesting. Do you have any interesting hobbies?
I love listening to music, going to fashion shows, spending time with family, and just taking care of people.
And finally, did you always know what you were going to do, or did something happen to put you on your path to success?
Well, I never really knew I was going to be a princess. I just knew that I was to go out and meet the people and love them.
Thank you, Princess Diana. And now we have Theodore Roosevelt. So what are you famous for?
I'm most famous for my political career and being the 26th President of the United States, and I'm also famous for being very energetic.
How did you get your start?
I was elected to the New York Assembly, and I campaigned for Benjamin Harrison in 1888 and William McKinley in 1896.
What is something that most people do not know about you?
That while at a rally in 1912, I was shot in the chest and I finished a 90-minute speech before going to the hospital.
Wow. And finally, do you have any interesting hobbies?
I enjoy nature, and I've gone on multiple safaris in South America and Africa. I also spent a few months hunting in the Dakota Territories, and I founded the national parks.
Thank you for joining us today, Theodore Roosevelt. And look who just flew in to join us. It's Amelia Earhart. So what are you most famous for?
I'm famous for being one of the world's greatest female pilots at my time and fighting for female rights while doing so. I completed many world records, and I also worked through the World War I and the Great Depression.
What is something that most people do not know about you?
I grew up with a lot of family issues. My parents were divorced, and we had a lot of money issues. My dad ended up getting sick and passing away while I was in college, and I never really had any privileges growing up.
Did you always know what you were going to do, or did something happen to put you on the path to your success?
Well, when I was young, my father would take me to carnivals and fairs, and I would see the planes fly overhead, and I just decided that I wanted to be a pilot, and ever since I've been flying.
What piece of advice would you give to someone that wants to follow in your footsteps?
Always take the risk, because there are going to be a lot of risk in life, and if you never take them, you're just going to live a boring life.
Thank you for joining us today, Amelia Earhart. And next we have Stan Lee. So, what are you most famous for?
I created the entire Marvel franchise.
That's cool. What is something that most people do not know about you?
Most of my parents are actually immigrant from Romania.
Who or what influenced you the most in your life?
Probably when I was younger, I liked to read and draw a lot, so I think that helped me get my start.
Did you always know what you were going to do, or did something happen to put you on the path to your success?
When I graduated high school, I worked at a comic book store to help my parents pay rent, and I just kind of fell in love with it.
And finally, what piece of advice would you give to someone that wants to follow in your footsteps?
If you have an idea that you genuinely think is good, don't let some idiot tell you otherwise.
Thank you for joining us today, Stan Lee. Next, we have Steve Jobs. What are you most famous for?
I am most famous for creating Apple and inventing the iPhone.
What is something that most people do not know about you?
That I was fired from Apple. When I came back, I only paid myself $1 a year.
Did you always know what you were going to do, or did something happen to put you on your path to success?
I did. Since I was little, I liked building things and making electronics.
And finally, do you have any regrets in your life?
I regret not spending a lot of time with my family.
Thank you for joining us, Steve Jobs. Now we have Clara Barton. Thank you for joining us. What are you most famous for?
I'm famous for founding the American Red Cross. After the Civil War, I went to Switzerland and visited a family friend named John Appia. He told me about the newly formed International Red Cross, and when I returned to the USA, I campaigned for a long 8 years to get the president to sign a treaty.
What is something that most people do not know about you?
Most people don't know that I was a serious tomboy. My brothers Stephen and David taught me how to play football and ride horses bareback.
Do you have any interesting hobbies?
Like I said before, my brothers Stephen and David taught me how to play football, so I enjoy playing football and riding horses. My family owned a soap business, so I also enjoyed making soap.
And finally, did you always know what you were going to do when you grew up, or did something happen to put you on your path to success?
I didn't always know what I was going to do when I grew up. My sisters Dorothy and Sally were teachers, so I always thought I was going to be a teacher. But when my brother David fell off a barn roof and got very sick, I nursed him to health. After this, I was a teacher after that, but when the Civil War broke out, I became a nurse.
Thank you for joining us today, Clara Barton. And now we have Davy Crockett. What are you most famous for?
I'm most famous for being one of the world's best frontiermen and fighting in 2 wars.
How did you get your start?
By my dad taking me hunting at the age of 3 and him teaching me how to shoot at the age of 7.
What is something most people do not know about you?
I ran in 2 elections and I won both of them.
And finally, who or what influenced you the most in your life?
My dad, because growing up he wanted me to be just like him.
Thank you for joining us today, Davy Crockett. And now we have Neil Armstrong. He's just landed from the moon, and now he's come back to join us. What are you most famous for?
I'm most famous for being the first person to walk on the moon. Me and some other people went on Apollo 11, and I walked on the moon and said, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
Did you always know what you were going to do, or did something happen to put you on your path to success?
No, I didn't know. My late daughter, Karen, was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and then 2 months after, she died of pneumonia.
What is something most people do not know about you?
Something most people don't know about me is that I brought my daughter's Karen's shoe to the moon in remembrance of her.
And finally, what piece of advice would you give to someone that wants to follow in your footsteps?
Just because there's some rocks in the road doesn't mean you can't beat boulders.
Thank you for joining us, Neil Armstrong. And now we have Julia Child. What are you most famous for?
I was a famous cooker. I was a famous chef, author, and television personality. I was the first woman to host a TV show.
What is something most people do not know about you?
I was a spy in World War II. I was 6'2". My first dish was not about my cooking show. It was about my book tour, The Mastering the Art of French Cooking.
Do you have any interesting hobbies?
Yes, I have a few interesting hobbies. I love writing cookbooks, traveling, and cooking with my husband.
And finally, did you always know what you were going to do, or did something happen to put you on your path to success?
I kind of knew what I wanted to do. I kind of wanted to be an author, but then when I met my husband, we moved to Paris, and he always was cooking, so I just started cooking with him and became a cooker.
Thank you for joining us today, Julia Child. And now we have Jane Goodall joining us. So Jane, what are you most famous for?
I'm most famous for living in Tanzania for over 30 years, living with and studying the gems.
What is something that most people do not know about you?
Most people don't know that I was interested in nature at a very young age, and I would always go out in my mother's garden and look for insects and animals to study and write about.
Who or what influenced you the most in your life?
My mother, Vanny, was always very supportive of my dreams and hobbies, and she influenced my life greatly.
And finally, did you always know what you were going to do, or did something happen to put you on your path to success?
I pretty much always knew what I was going to do since I was young. I used to watch Tarzan. And I always knew that I wanted to live in Africa like him.
Thank you for joining us today, Jane Goodall. And now we have Pele. What are you most famous for?
I'm most famous for being an amazing soccer player. I'm famous for creating the bicycle kick, helping Brazil win 3 World Cups, and scoring 1,283 goals in my career.
How did you get your start?
I got my start by started playing soccer when I was 10. Me and my friends created a team named September 7th. We didn't have soccer shirts or shorts, and we couldn't afford cleats, so we named ourselves the Shoeless Ones.
What is something about you that most people don't know?
Most people don't know that whenever I get paid for playing soccer, I help my parents pay for their rent. And I was in the Army when I was 17.
And finally, who or what influenced you the most in your life?
Well, I think my dad influences me the most in my work. He influenced me when I was young, and still today he influenced me to do better while I play soccer. He's a really great guy and a really awesome soccer player.
Thank you for joining us today, Pele. And now, Alexander Hamilton has joined us. What are you most famous for?
I am most famous for being one of the founding fathers and the first Secretary of Treasury. I was also a Revolutionary War hero.
How did you get your start?
I was an orphan in the West Indies, and I wanted to do something bigger than myself, so I moved to America and I played a major role in the Revolution.
What is something that most people do not know about you?
Before I was the first Secretary of Treasury, I was a well-known lawyer. I also dabbled in poetry, and I was George Washington's assistant, and I quit on him.
Do you have any regrets?
Yes, I regret walking out on George Washington because he wouldn't let me battle. I also regret challenging Aaron Burr to a duel because that led to my death.
Thank you for joining us today, Alexander Hamilton. And now we have John F. Kennedy. What are you most famous for?
Being the 35th president and the youngest president.
Who or what influenced you the most in your life?
Eleanor Roosevelt because of her dedication and getting stuff done.
Do you have any interesting hobbies?
I like to play golf, I like swimming, and I also like to play and watch football.
Do you have any regrets in your life?
Sending people to Cuba in a mission that turned into a disaster.
Thank you for joining us today, JFK. And now, Helen Keller has joined us. What are you most famous for?
I was the very first person to read, write, and learn while being deaf and blind. I also wrote several best-selling novels and inspired millions of people.
What is something most people don't know about you?
I was a political activist for women's suffrage, and I became a worldwide lecturer.
Who or what influenced you the most in your life?
My environment was my biggest motivation. I also had a teacher, Annie Zollivan, that inspired me to learn.
And finally, do you have any interesting hobbies?
My passion is writing stories. I also enjoy traveling the world.
Thank you for joining us today, Helen Keller. Straight from the happiest place on earth, we have Walt Disney. What are you most famous for?
I'm famous for making the Disney company, Disneyland, and Mickey Mouse, and I made the movies Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty.
How did you get your start?
I made cartoons with my friends in a shed behind my house in Kansas City, and then I moved to Hollywood and started a company with my brother.
What is something most people do not know about you?
I would go to Disneyland and wear disguises so no one would recognize me, and if they did, I would give them an autograph.
Do you have any interesting hobbies?
I do swimming, ice skating, and horseback riding, and I like to draw and animate cartoons.
And finally, do you have any regrets in your life?
My biggest regret was buying a house for my parents that had poisonous gas leaking in it, and because of that, they both got sick and my mom died.
Thank you for joining us today, Walt Disney. And straight from the Outback, we have Steve Irwin.
Crikey, sorry I'm late. The alligators were hungry.
Steve, what are you most famous for?
I am most famous for my TV show, The Crocodile Hunter, and my passion for animals.
Who or what influenced you the most in your life?
My mom and dad, because they both loved animals.
Do you have any interesting hobbies?
My most interesting hobby is taking care of animals. And when I'm not taking care of animals, I'm either finding them or taking care of my zoo.
And finally, do you have any regrets?
No, not that I can think of, because I've saved so many animals from danger that I can't even count.
Thank you for joining us today, Steve Irwin.
You're welcome.